Have you ever found yourself in a beautiful location, you take your camera and try your best to capture that scene, only to be crushed when you see that image because it just doesn't capture the scene the way your eyes saw it? Well, it could be that you took the shot okay. The problem may be in the way you edited that shot, or maybe you didn't edit it at all. Today in this video, I'm going to cover my 8 critical rules to editing your photos. And until you master these, you may be stuck in the land of shooting snapshots and never get to that level where you're crafting masterful images. And I'll also share some of my workflow in Lightroom and Photoshop. This video is all about editing, so let's dive in. Hey everybody, and welcome back. It's so good to see you all here again this week. I'm hoping you're out shooting with your DSLR or your mirrorless cameras, and if you've missed any of my previous episodes in this series, I'll put a link to those down in the description. And also, if you haven't gotten my mobile download, I'll put a link for that too. Now, if you enjoy learning about photography, or you just like being with me out in the field as I shoot photography, please consider subscribing to my channel and sharing it with your friends. Now, let's get to editing. Okay, at first, editing your photos may seem a little overwhelming or intimidating, but trust me, this is a really enjoyable, fun part of the process, and it's really where the artistry comes into play. Now, you probably are actually better at editing photos than you may realize. Yeah, it's true, because you take photos on your phone, right? Well, everybody's gone through in those presets, whether you're on Facebook or Instagram or you're just on your camera, you can choose presets like vivid or high contrast or things like summer tone. What does that even mean? But you know what looks good and you know what looks awful. So don't kid yourself. This is not rocket science. It's all really about personal taste. And that's really all editing is. It's capturing your artistic vision for how that photo needs to look. So as we discuss this stuff, guys, just remember that you have the ultimate say on how you want your photography to look. It's an art, and it is subjective. So no matter how I'm editing photos or what you may see out there, you make the call on how you think your photography should look. But I'm just going to share with you some of my experience and some of my workflow on how I edit photography, and you take these tools that you learn and put them to good use in how you see fit. Now, you may notice a little bit of background noise right now. That's because it's like 100 degrees outside. And bear with me, I'm going to have to keep the AC going in this little bubble shell of an office that I have because it's so stinking hot and I cannot focus or concentrate when I turn that air conditioner off. So bear with me. Now, I want to share with you a little analogy. We're going to compare editing your photos to actually baking. Let's just suppose you're going to bake some chocolate chip cookies. You go to the grocery store and you go to the cooler and you get one of those rolls of the pre-packaged cookie dough. Now, you still have to cut those out, that's true, and you put them on a cookie sheet and you throw them in the oven. But did you really have any say on the ingredients or the ultimate flavor of those? No, it's kind of like those little presets in your phone, okay? You didn't get to choose all the ratios of everything, so you really don't have that much control until you really take control of each individual ingredient. By contrast, editing professionally would be like going to the grocery store, bypassing the cooler and going straight to the baking aisle. You get the flour, you get the leavening, some kind of sweetener, you get your eggs, your butter, your vanilla, and you come back and you mix all that stuff together in a kitchen. Now, we also have to assume that you've got the equipment, the tools, and the kitchen space to be able to put all that stuff together. And in our case, we're going to be cooking in a commercial kitchen, Photoshop and Lightroom. Now, I've been on Photoshop since 1995. I was just a kid when I first started in Photoshop. Lightroom probably about 2005-ish, somewhere around there. And so I'm used to moving around in a commercial kitchen. So there's absolutely no way that I'm going to leave that space and start baking on an easy bake oven, okay? Now, I know there's some free software and some really cheap software out there that you can use to edit your photography. And if you want to try those, you're completely okay to do that. However, those are still going to try to emulate what would be in the commercial space. So I want to share with you Lightroom and Photoshop a little bit of workflow, because my hope for you is that you're at least sniffing around in that direction like you may be in that commercial kitchen pretty soon. So what do you do with all these raw ingredients? Well, it stands to reason that a chef would know intimately what happens to the ingredients in a recipe. He's going to know, hey, if I remove a little bit of butter or if I add some extra chocolate chips, it's going to behave in this way. So we really just have to get in and experiment and learn what these different ingredients do and how we bake those ingredients so that we can end up with the result that we're looking for. Now, to do that, I've got one first rule that I want to share with you, and that is to trust your eyes, okay? You're going to take those photos off your camera, you're going to bring them into your computer, and you're going to launch and start looking at them. So my first rule of photo editing is just trust your instincts and trust your eyes. If you see one of your shots that looks a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark,
probably is, Martin, it probably is.
Just trust that. So let's take a dive into Lightroom and look at some of my photos. Okay, before we get started, I want to share something with you. Everything that we're about to do is non-destructive, okay? You don't have to worry about ruining your photos. We can get in our little kitchen here and start slinging ingredients and making recipes with reckless abandon, and we don't really have to worry about ruining anything. It's non-destructive. We can just undo. Unlike in a real kitchen, if you screw up a recipe, you're going to have to throw them to the dog, and maybe the dog won't even eat them, right? I've done that before. So this is different. We can just go back a few steps, undo. We're not going to really mess anything up. So for starters, I'm in Adobe Lightroom, and I've got some photos loaded up here from the last few months, and I just put these in at random. I've got some beach pictures, I've got a few scenes here, I've even got some from my client work. I want to show you a particular thing there, some things from my pond. I've even got an astro shot here. So when you first load your photos up into Lightroom, you're going to see kind of what I remember from the film days. I think of Lightroom as like a digital darkroom. And if you're in library, it's kind of like seeing your contact sheets of all your negatives and how they turned out so that you can go through and kind of cull those out and really find the shot that you want to focus on editing. And that's exactly what we can do right here. So just remember the P key. P is in Paul, P is in pick. If we like a shot like our little prairie dogs here, we can hit P and it'll put a little flag. You see that little flag up there? I can choose one from this series and I can flag that one that I want to edit. You know, we can flag as many as we want to that we say, hey, I want to take a little bit closer look at that shot. I think I want to look at one of these two for a specific reason. And then we can narrow that down with filters and say, just show us the ones that we flagged. So now down here at the bottom, we only have the photos that we flagged. Now I'm in the little thumbnail view here. We can go back to filters off and we can see all of them again. So you can cull through your shots and really narrow down that way which ones you really want to focus on editing. You can even rate those. You can click 1 through 5 and give them like 5 stars, 4 stars. You can take away the stars, and those are just ways to help you organize your photography. And it's kind of deep. I'm just going to scratch the surface here. So let's get right into editing. So rule number 2 is to get intimate. Take a deep dive with your photography. So let's do that with this first shot of these prairie dogs. And what I mean by that is to really look closely at this image. Now you can't see it zoomed out. We're going to have to zoom in and kind of move around to really get a sense of our shot. I'm looking at areas of focus, areas of bokeh. I'm looking at this little deal here, like a little gremlin on the tree there. I don't know if that's something on my lens that caused that. I'm just looking around. There's another little bright spot that's a little bit distracting. I see that, hey, I got this little family of prairie dogs in pretty good focus, so good deal there. I can see some of the flower detail if it's on that same level with them. See the flowers over here pretty sharp. This was shot pretty shallow and with a long lens, so I have a really shallow depth of field on this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm just looking at the histogram. I see that it's fairly balanced. You know, it's got a little mountain here. There's not anything terribly hot. You know, there's nothing really crushingly dark in this photo. And that gives me an idea that we can probably increase our contrast on this. So right off the top, I should have had this already scrolled up for you, but at the top, I see that I'm shooting on camera flat. That's another thing I meant to tell you in one of the previous episodes is on my camera, I shoot on flat all the time. Because if you put on vivid or high contrast or anything like that, that would almost be like getting a box of cookie mix. So yeah, you're still putting the eggs and the vanilla and the butter and everything in, but maybe you still don't have complete control over those ratios. We want raw ingredients, guys. We want to be able to choose exactly what we're dealing with. So I shoot on flat picture profile in my Nikon cameras so that it's sort of flat, and that gives us lots of control. So if you look at our sliders, we can control our exposure, we can increase our exposure, we can decrease our exposure, we can increase our contrast, and I kind of like that. See how that starts to bring out what contrast is doing is brightening the highlights and darkening the shadows a little bit to kind of give more of a range. And watch what happens to that histogram, how that mountain spreads out. You see that? As I increase contrast, that's exactly what it's doing. But there is a place that it goes a little bit too far. And that's actually point number 3. Go too far. If you take one of these sliders all the way to the extremes, let's look at the whites. We can take those to the extremes. That's too far. But the benefit of going too far is it's like adding a little bit of extra chocolate chips to a cookie. We want to give it power. We want that cookie to have the right amount of chocolate, just enough without going overboard, because we want that really rich chocolatey flavor, and we want that rich detail in our photography as well. So we're going to find that critical breaking point where we can bring our contrast up, and let's see, where's our breaking point on contrast? I would say right in there is our breaking point. And I'm seeing that the little guy, his shoulder, or her shoulder, mama's shoulder, is getting a little hot on the highlights. We may dial that back down a little bit. Let's bring our shadows up just a little bit. Let's crush our blacks down. Yeah. So I think we've already improved this photo. And I'll say that right up here in this section on the top of your Develop tab is really where the real work is done. 90% of editing your photography can be done just with these few basic settings. It's pretty powerful. So we've already got these guys looking pretty good. Now let's take another look at our next option, which is our tone curve. We can also increase our contrast here. We can deepen our shadows. We can kind of boost our highlights a little bit. Hopefully we don't go too far, but remember, we can undo anything and we can take it back down. Say that you don't like one of your settings. Say that we don't like our contrast setting. You can just double click and take it right back to 0. See, it's really non-destructive and it's very, very forgiving. Okay, so let's go down to the next thing. This is where I love to hang out. Down in the HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. I like to look to see what our color tones really have to offer. And there's a lot of yellow and green here, so I'm going to play with the sliders and see what I like. See, I can kind of darken the greens and I can kind of boost the yellows a little bit. I don't want to boost them too much so they just lose that yellow. But it's finding that perfect happy medium where you've got enough yellow, but maybe the grass is taking a back seat to those little yellow flowers. And on saturation, I can dial down the saturation on the greens and dial up the saturation on the yellows and help those pop a little bit too. So find those colors in your shot that you really want to accentuate. Get intimate with that shot and find out who are the major characters in your shot, telling the story, who needs a little more attention, what needs to be dialed back and have a little bit of less attention. And that's where you really make your shots come alive, is when you really accentuate what's important and dial back what's not important. And that's really all we're doing here. Now, one thing I'll mention about color is that our eyes have the ability to adjust to whatever we're seeing. So rule number 4 is go away. Go away. Get up from the computer, walk, get yourself a cup of coffee, and then come back. And what you may realize is when you sit down back at that computer, you're like, oh my gosh, this is putrid green. What was I thinking? It's way too saturated. Let's go up here to this native slider too for saturation. We can take global, which means we're taking the saturation of the whole image, and we can boost it, or we can dial it down. I hadn't touched that yet. I hardly ever raise the global saturation. I like to raise it in incremental steps with these individual sliders. We can increase the vibrance too, and that's kind of like the punch within each color. Maybe increase the vibrance just a little bit. You may play around with texture and clarity, but as you can see, it goes into the land of no return pretty quickly on clarity. So I would use just a dose of that. It's like salt, okay, in your recipe. Clarity is pretty powerful to mess with. Now it does accentuate things very well, but it actually reduces some of the saturation, so just be careful with that. Now rule number 5 is to get selective and aggressive. Now what I mean by that is to really kind of consider a whole recomposition of your shot. Let's go into the crop tool. Now with the crop tool, I'm looking at things that I just really don't think are adding anything to this composition. I don't think that sky is really adding anything. Remember, light areas draw the eye away, and so let's just see what happens if we crop down our sky, and let's see what happens if we get rid of this really super out of focus area down here at the bottom. That's not really contributing anything to the story. Let's bring that up a little bit, maybe not quite that far. We want some out of focus. And then I think I did a pretty okay job in just framing these family of prairie dogs because they're already on this vertical axis on our rule of thirds. That crop tool is amazing because it pops up your rule of thirds for you. I may bring it over. I'm looking at this tree in the background, this little highlight area, and it's not too consequential. I don't know that we have to crop it out. I kind of like that wide pano, don't you? Yeah. So once you have it kind of where you want, you can click OK. But I'll mention too that right here, if you did have your horizon off, you know, you're looking at it and being really critical, we can adjust our horizon here. I don't think that it was off, so I'm going to undo that adjustment and just hit OK. Now I think we've drastically improved this shot, but now let's get creative with this thing. Rule number 6 is get creative. And the fortunate thing about Lightroom is it really gives you the ability to get creative. So let's go back up to some of these other tools here. Now remember, I saw a little gremlin, I call it, up here in this tree. If you had dust on your lens, or if you have some kind of little lens flare or something that's distracting, we can take this and put it on heal, and by scrolling up and down on our mouse wheel, we can kind of make that as small as possible to really cover that area. And what the system is doing is it's finding an area that has a similar tone, and it's bringing information over to cover that up. So we got rid of that little highlight. Let's find that other one. You see that? I don't know what caused that, but let's get rid of that too. That's a little bit distracting. See, and it pulls a tone. And if you don't think it did a great job, you can just grab the handle and move and say, no, I want you to pull from somewhere over here. And it'll try to pull information from another place. So you have a lot of control. Now let's look at my favorite tool in Lightroom is probably the gradients and the brushes. They're amazing. We can drag a gradient down, and to show you what's covering that, if you hit O, it gives you a red mask, and that's kind of what is actually being affected by this tool. So click O and go out of it. So I can take the exposure down on the trees, and that just kind of draws the eye down to these prairie dogs. And I can click that or hit OK, and I can go make another one, and I can bring it up from the bottom. I may just affect the shadows. I may not do the whole exposure there. Yeah, probably somewhere in there. And I'm gonna hit OK. And I actually think that we have made that shot better. We can click reset to see where we started from, and then we can undo that to see where we went to. And I really think we've improved that photo, don't you? Yeah, let's take a look at another one. Real quickly, this is an area where we can use our crop tool to straighten that horizon. I noticed I had the horizon off on that ocean, so we can fix that pretty quickly. Let's talk about sharpening real quick. Now, one thing that people kind of have a misunderstanding about is that sharpening can fix out of focus areas, and that's just not the case. If you've poorly focused a shot, there's nothing sharpening can do to bring that back from the land of no return. However, you can see the focus area on these sea oats or these grasses is pretty sharp on these sea oats, but watch what happens when I do affect a little bit of sharpening. you can just see the edges of those get even more crisp. We don't want to go too far because then they start looking like almost drawn or something, like just not natural at all. And that's why I believe the sharpening starts to go in the red. It's kind of like redlining. You don't want to go there. I would say the most ever goes around 50 or something like that. But sharpening is a really, really powerful tool. So let's go over here to be really creative. I want to show you a shot that I took in my pond. I'm going to choose this photo and this photo. One was taken at a 30th of a second, one was taken at an 1/8 of a second. I'm going to right click on those, go to Photo Merge, HDR. It's going to pop up this dialog box. I'm going Auto Align, Auto Settings, and I'm leaving the deghost amount to low instead of none. There was a little bit of wind that was blowing outside on these leaves, and so I'm going to leave the deghost amount to low, and it's going to pop up this image, which is a lot more dynamic range to work with. And I'm just going to click merge, and it's going to put those two images together, and now my histogram is going to be pretty balanced because I've got a lot of information in the highlights and a lot of information in the shadows to work with. So if you have two photos and you're kind of on the fence as to where to expose, just shoot them both from a tripod, and you can bring them in Lightroom and have tons and tons of latitude. This is where you can really get creative. Okay, let's see what it did. Look at our histogram. It's really nice and expanded. It's got information in the highlights, information in the shadows. Let's boost our contrast and see what happens. And let's bring down our whites overall. Let's take our exposure down just a little bit. And I want to show you something else that we can do with the gradient. This is the area that I'm working on. We can actually go to Arrange Mask and click Color. Grab our eyedropper and let's pick some of these greens from that lily pad, and we can hold Option, and we can actually decrease, and what is white is actually what we're affecting. So now this should only affect the green areas of our lily pads. Maybe we want to increase the exposure on them just a little bit, or increase the contrast on those a little bit to help those water droplets pop just a little bit. We may crush the blacks, but then bring up the whites a little bit. Overall exposure, yeah, somewhere right in there. And then we can do another gradient in our sky. Bring that down, and let's look at what dehaze might do to that sky. Check that out. That puts a lot more drama in that sky. Maybe a little contrast too. Yeah, maybe we pull the shadows down, and we've got a much more interesting looking photo. At this point, I want to teach you rule number 7, and that's to get surgical with your photography. That's where you just don't accept anything that isn't contributing to your shot. You're going to eliminate everything that's a distraction, and that's where I think Photoshop really has the key to your success. So let me show you a shot that I did here of one of my clients down in San Antonio. These are some doctors and nurses and rad techs that are working at the emergency clinic. It's a great clinic if you're in the San Antonio area. Love these people, they're great. So let's increase the contrast on our doctors and nurses, and let's maybe go ahead and bring down a gradient, and let's see what happens with clarity. I'm just gonna decrease our exposure on our sky, dehaze it a little bit. Yeah, let's get some drama in that sky. I think they're exposed pretty well, but there's just some distracting elements in this shot, like these power lines here, and of course I'll probably crop just to remove that truck. We've got some grass growing through the parking lot and just some distracting elements. I will probably always go to Photoshop in order to change things like that. It's just so much more powerful. So I'm just exporting this shot real quickly. We're gonna open it in Photoshop. We're just taking a little surface dive here in Photoshop. But it's so stinking powerful, I just gotta show you some of my favorite tools. It's exporting, it's gonna open in Photoshop, and here we go. Now Lightroom is like our digital darkroom. Photoshop is like our digital surgery suite. Okay, we can really get technical and scientific with Photoshop. But I want to show you something about how Photoshop works that will work to your advantage if you just understand this. If you remember back in chemistry class, if you're as old as me, I'm 41, maybe you're not quite that old, our teachers didn't have digital boards. Our chemistry teacher had an overhead projector. Do you remember those, or do you know what those are? She would draw the layers of a cell in biology class, and she would put them on layers of transparencies, and that's exactly the way that Photoshop works. So if we duplicate this layer and we grab our move tool, which is over here, this is our tools and this is our work area, and our layers on our transparencies are over here. And we can move that around, and you see it's just on top. It's on top of that other layer. And if we make a shape, we can use this rectangular marquee real quick. I'll just make a quick shape. I'll go ahead and make a new layer. See, it's completely transparent. There's nothing there. I'm going to use this paint bucket. I'm going to fill that with blue. I'm going to make another layer, and I'm going to make a circle. Let's make a circle over here. And if you hold shift, you can keep it to be a perfect circle. It's a little trick. Let's grab this ambulance color, and now we have, you see we got shapes on top, and we can grab any one of these layers and move those around. And the powerful thing about Photoshop is that we can change the layer kind or layer effect here to multiply. We got color burn. We've got all these different things that we can do to overlay that selection. And I'm going to show you what we can do with like a multiply layer here in a second. For now, let's just delete this or turn this off. See, we can reveal and hide those. That's pretty convenient. But let me show you my favorite tool, I believe, in Photoshop, and that is going to be our clone tool, which is the way I fix many images. And the way that works, let me zoom in here, and if you hold the space bar, you can kind of drag around. Now what the clone tool is, it used to be called rubber stamp tool or the clone tool, and if you hold down option, you can grab a target. I'm going to make my brush just a little bit smaller just so I get this cable, and I can sample a cloud. I can sample the sky next to it, and I can just start painting, and it will track the area next to it, and I can clone the sky and get rid of that cable. So let me undo. I can keep hitting Command Z and undo that. Another way to do that would be to grab our healing brush and just trace the cable and let it content aware fill this area. I should have gotten a little bit larger brush. Let's see what happens though. Wow, see that really took care of it almost by itself. I may have to go back and do a little touching up on that, but that did a pretty good job. Let's hide our blue layer for now, and let's do one other method. I'm going to grab this little lasso marquee, and I'm going to trace around these ugly cables, because maybe I want to put copy. Uh-oh, I made a bad selection. You can hit shift and grab more of it. I'm just showing you what's possible. Don't get bent out of shape because this is advanced stuff. Don't worry about that. Let's go up to edit, content aware fill. This is a kind of a new feature of Photoshop that's been around for the last few years, and it does a pretty good job also at getting rid of that area. Now it did put that on another layer, see? But I can also use the clone tool to fix things in this parking lot. Say that I don't really like this utility cover right here. I can go over here and sample. Look how powerful this is. I can sample the crack right there in the concrete and come down here and line it up again and just paint right over it. I can get rid of that spot. I can click here, paint over that. I can just even use the little healing brush and get rid of these little rocks. Oh, I'm on the wrong layer. Let me go here. Back to the layer that is native, and I can clone and content aware, fill those little areas out. I can even get rid of this whole scratch on the parking lot. If I feel like that's a distraction to my photo, I can really just get rid of all those distractions. And back to our clone tool, I can sample this. I like to find a line that kind of leads down from that to sample. Grab a little bit larger brush, and we can just lose all of that grassy area. I don't even like that crack. Let's clean that whole area up. Uh-oh, we got our manhole cover back. I accidentally put it on another layer before, so we're gonna get rid of that. Okay, there we go. Now back to that multiply thing that I was telling you about. Check this out. You can go to Edit, Transform, Free Transform, and we can drag this blue out across the sky if we wanted a deeper blue. We can make a layer mask, grab our gradient tool, go to linear gradient, and what that does is that just hides everything below that. And if we wanted to, we can take the opacity of that down, get a little bit darker sky, and then if we don't want the building in, check this out. We can do a polygonal lasso and just grab the hard edges of our building if we want to just isolate it. There's just so much you can do in Photoshop, guys. I'm not trying to just intimidate you or blow your mind, but we can paint bucket in black over that area and just hide. The tolerance should be at 100 on paint bucket. And now we've got a little sky layer. And Photoshop's so powerful, we can just take the transparency of that layer down to nothing. We can take it to 0, and then we can dial it back up to where we want to stop. And then when we're finished, of course, we can crop. In Photoshop, we can crop. Check this out. We can get rid of that ugly pickup truck. That's my red truck in the background there. I think I'm going to leave it. And this is what I do all the time for advertising photography. You know, we can put that on there. Now that I see it, I don't like my red truck. It's too distracting. So I'm going to go back into my crop tool, and I'm going to come over just to our doctors. This would be something they could put on Instagram or Facebook. See, now it's just focused on the doctors. So we can crop in Photoshop too. Now this leads me to point number 8, and that is to get out. See, we can spend hours editing a photo. So how much is too much, or how much is enough? You might go in to think you're going to edit for about 20 minutes, and then 4 hours later you're still working on those sliders. Once you get in the kitchen, you kind of have a lot of fun, so it's kind of a challenge to know when to just stop. So I hope this helps you see a little bit of what's possible in editing your photography with these 8 tips. Now I know it's kind of like a deep ocean out there. It truly, truly is a deep ocean, but that doesn't mean you have to hop in a submarine and go straight to the bottom of a trench with James Cameron. You don't even have to put on a scuba gear. We're just asking you to put on a snorkel mask, because most of the things that you need are right under the surface anyway, and it's a great place to hang out, is just snorkeling across the surface in all of these tools. I've been in Photoshop since I was a kid, and I'm self-taught. I'm self-taught in Lightroom, and I promise you, if you just hang out and go through those sliders, you will pick it up faster than you even can imagine. So be bold, be brave, get into the software, get into those sliders and experiment. And as you get out there and you explore God's creative world, don't get beat up over the idea that you can't possibly capture something the way you see it. It's true, we can't even do justice to what God has created. Faster than you can imagine. Faster than you can imagine. So get into the faster than you can imagine. So get into the software, get into those sliders, experiment, be bold, be brave. But as you get out there and you explore God's creation, don't get beat up over this idea that you can't capture what your eyes are seeing. It's true, God is just too big. There's no way we can possibly do Him justice with a photo anyway. But what we're trying to do is just to use our artistic abilities and push that image around to give the people who view it just a little glimpse of what we actually saw and what God actually created. And you can do that with your photography. So if you get an inspiration, go with it. A few days ago, I was out in my pasture and I noticed that we had the perfect conditions for astrophotography. So I visited my quince tree, which is just a few steps away from my house, and there was no wind. It was a completely tiny sliver of a moon that was about to set at about 9:30. So I knew I was going to have a really dark sky. There was no wind, and here I am with this quince tree. And then an inspiration hit me. I could not possibly capture the full glory of God's Milky Way. Now that's just out of the question. I'm like, you would have to literally do a back bend to see this thing all. So what I did is I actually took the camera and I started shooting, and I did a vertical panorama. I wasn't sure if it was going to work out or not, but I would take 15-degree increments and take a shot and then move the camera 15 degrees, 15 degrees, 15 degrees, all the way over until literally I had the camera flipped upside down and I was shooting the trees that were back behind me. Now, to my surprise, I brought this thing back in Lightroom, and kind of like we did the little HDR stitching, I did a pano, but it was vertical and it worked. That little inspiration that I had actually worked in the most crazy vertical pano that I've ever seen, or at least that I've ever shot. And now I think it's actually one of my favorite shots that I've ever taken. And it was based on just this tiny little inspiration, and I just knew it was all going to have to happen in the edit.
God of angel armies, you're the power inside me. You're the Prince of Peace in the midst.
So what if you do take a shot that kind of captures that vision, and it can give people chills down their spine and make them feel something and elicit a visceral reaction from your photography? That's what this is all about. Just go for it. God has given each of us a creativity that's different and unique with each one of us. The way I edit a photo is going to be different than the way you edit a photo. The way you capture it's going to be different. You could literally have the exact same camera, the exact same lens as me. You could be in the exact same software as me and come up with a vastly different result. And that's what I so love about our craft of photography. And when you master editing, you really are going to take your shots from being just snapshots to true crafted images that are worth printing and hanging on a wall. So once again, I want to encourage you to get out there and shoot and now edit your photography. Now, I hope you're getting value from this series, and I hope you've gotten something from this video. If you have, please like this video and consider subscribing to my channel and sharing it with your friends. And don't forget to click that little bell so that you'll know every single time that I go live with another episode. Now, get out there this week, and if you have any questions, I love the interaction. Please leave questions in the comments. I hope I haven't left you behind or intimidated you about Photoshop or Lightroom. Please don't be intimidated. Just get out there and practice. You will be able to pick these up pretty quickly. So get out there and let's explore God's creation with childlike wonder. And until next week, good luck, guys. And if you just haven't had enough of me today, here come 2 more links to videos in my series. Thanks, guys. See you next week.